So while on this topic of smallpox inoculation practices within Africa, I believe it's absolutely imperative to make mention of the direct contribution that traditional African smallpox inoculation methods made to the development and widespread adoption of smallpox vaccination in the United States of America. So the first instance of smallpox vaccination being done in America was recorded in 1721 or 1722, I believe, and that was in colonial Boston. And this was an exercise that was spearheaded by a man called Cotton Mather and a physician called Zabdiel Boylston. So Cotton Mather was a very well-known preacher and community leader in colonial Boston at the time. And he was very well read up on diseases and medicine and things of that sort. So around 1714, there was a letter that was written by a certain Dr. Emmanuel Timonius, who had spent time in the Ottoman Empire, and he had come across a treatment of smallpox that the locals were using, where they would make an incision in somebody's skin, they would harvest some pus from a mature pustule of a smallpox patient, and they would rub it in. And again, it would create a milder version of smallpox that would subside within a couple of weeks, and that person would then end up becoming immune from smallpox for the rest of their life. So this letter that Dr. Emmanuel Timonius wrote was then circulated to the Royal Society of Medicine by somebody who was part of that society. And this letter was published by the Royal Society of Medicine, and Cotton Mather managed to get hold of it and read it. And once he got hold of it and read this letter, it triggered a response from Cotton Mather to the Royal Society of Medicine regarding Emmanuel Timonius's account on this type of smallpox inoculation being performed in the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul. And the following that I'm going to read is an excerpt from the letter that Cotton Mather himself wrote to the Royal Society of Medicine regarding Emmanuel Timonius's account on smallpox treatment. I am willing to confirm to you in a favorable opinion of Dr. Timonius's communication, and therefore I do assure you that many months before I met with any intimations of treating the smallpox with the method of inoculation anywhere in Europe, I had from a servant of my own an account of its being practiced in Africa. Inquiring of my Negro man Onesimus, not his real name, by the way, obviously, who is a pretty intelligent fellow, whether he had ever had the smallpox, he answered both yes and no, and then told me that he had undergone an operation which had given him something of the smallpox and would forever preserve him from it, adding that it was often used among the Gourmantes, and whoever had the courage to use it was forever free of the fear of contagion. He described the operation to me and showed me in his arm the scar which it had left upon him, and his description of it made it the same that afterwards I found related unto you by your Timonius. So what Mather was basically saying here was that, oh, this is very interesting that I read this account that Mr. Timonius wrote. And a couple of years before I read this account of Mr. Timonius, I had actually heard of this being done in certain parts of Africa by a slave that I own, because Mather owned quite a few slaves. So Onesimus was sold to Cotton Mather around 1707, or rather given to Mather around 1707 by parishioners who had procured him from somewhere before that. And it's worth noting that Onesimus was most likely from the central region of modern-day Ghana, specifically Fort Coromantin in the Abanze region. And this is assumed to be the case by most historians today, because the Gourmantes people are a group of people who are actually from Africa and who thrived between 300 BC and 200 CE. And by the time Onesimus would have been born, the Gourmantes as a group of people would have ceased to thrive more than 1,000 years before. So it's highly unlikely that Onesimus had originated from where the Gourmantes people were. They existed in a region that is now in modern day southern Libya. And furthermore, there isn't much evidence to suggest that there are North African slaves that were taken during the transatlantic slave trade to the Americas. But a large majority of the slaves that were traded in America were traded by the British, and the British got most of their slaves from the West African coast. On top of that, the term that was used to refer to slaves that were taken from from Fort Coromantine was Coromantees, which bears a very striking resemblance to the term that Mather used to describe Onesimus. So, yeah, it's more likely that Onesimus was actually from the Abanza region in Ghana than he was from southern Libya. After Mather gathered all of this information from Onesimus, he then tried to get people to buy into this procedure within the community of colonial Boston. And people were not very keen on the idea because, obviously, as we all know, there was a lot of prejudice that existed within colonial Bostonians and really most colonial communities in the United States against ideas that originated from Africa and from Asia, which is where the ideas of inoculation against smallpox came from when Cotton Mather suggested that they do this within the community. However, Cotton Mather persisted and he persevered, and along with him, another physician called Zabdiel Boylston bought into the idea, and they decided to try it in 1721. And so they inoculated, using the method that was described to Cotton Mather by his slave Onesimus. They inoculated about 246 people against smallpox. And out of those 246 people, only about 6% died. At the end of 1722, the very same year, when they performed this experiment with the 246 people, it is recorded that about 6,000 people in colonial Boston contracted smallpox. And of those 6,000 people, about 15% died. And so it was based on this data that Cotton Mather collected that the idea of inoculation against smallpox started to gain more legitimacy and more notoriety, and it started to spread throughout the United States. There's also some people who make the claim that this instance of Cotton Mather and Zabdiel Boylston inoculating the 246 people against smallpox was the first clinical trial that ever took place in the history of the United States, and is one of the first instances of medical treatment based on quantitative measurement. So I think it's safe to say that the contribution that Onesimus, whatever his real name was, made to the discovery of this treatment was very, very huge. Because, like I said before, this is the inoculation against smallpox and the eradication of smallpox within the human population at large is known to be one of the most important medical triumphs that has ever been accomplished by human beings for the preservation of human life. And when we look at that purely in the context of the United States, it would not have happened if Onesimus the slave had not been given to Cotton Mather